50 years ago, this year, I went to the cinema to see a new movie. Get Carter, directed by Michael Hodges, his first film. I think about the only one that ever actually got him any acclaim. And the film was filmed and set in Newcastle. Now, Newcastle has quite a long history as a film setting. Payroll, I remember in the 1960 was one of the first. But Newcastle wasn't necessarily where the author of Get Carter, Ted Lewis, had intended his work to be set. The book was published in 1970, a year before the movie itself, and it was Lewis's second successful novel. He had quite a track record of writing successful criminal novels, British noir. He was a kind of local homebred successor to Raymond Chandler. But Lewis had nothing to do with Newcastle. He was born in 1940 in Manchester, and the family moved at quite a young age to Humberside. He studied art at Humberside College, where he was taught by Henry Treece, himself a prolific novelist. And Treece possibly influenced Lewis in starting to write. He worked in the advertising industry, and then really his great period of productivity was between 1965 and his death in 1980, in which time he wrote 9 successful novels, of which by far the most famous is Jack's Return Home. This film is Get Carter. But the novel isn't actually set, as I mentioned, in Newcastle. It's set probably in Scunthorpe, a very long way from Newcastle. It was only when the director and producer were scouting for locations in 1970 that they chanced upon Newcastle. And I remember Mike Hodges describing the place as having a great deal of squalid grandeur. That annoyed quite a lot of us, actually, because we thought Newcastle was all right. But what is remarkable, looking 50 years on, is how many of the iconic locations that became totemic as a result of the film, have now disappeared. Of course, the famous Get Carter car park in Gateshead is no more, though I believe you can still buy chunks of it, like the Berlin Wall, which means it's probably a very, very large car park. And here I'm standing on the high level bridge, which again features in the film, which we'll come to in a moment. But there was something else about Newcastle in 1970 that attracted the filmmakers. And this was Newcastle's perceived role as a centre for organised crime, OCGs, as I think they'd probably call it on Line of Duty. In 1967, 2 slot machine, one-armed bandit kings, Dennis Stafford and Michael Lavaglio, were convicted of murdering their associate Angus Sibbett, who was found shot to death in the back of his Jaguar motorcar. Jags were the preferred cars of villains, both in movies and in reality. This lifted the lid on a rather squalid subculture of local organised crime based around gambling, prostitution, pornography, and of course fiddling slot machines. And that was one of the reasons why Hodges decided that Newcastle was the perfect location. Filming took 8 months altogether, the whole process, and 40 days location shooting took place in Newcastle. The movie starred Michael Caine, of course, who definitely does not come from Newcastle, an East End boy. Also Britt, Ekland, John Osborne, and Ian Hendry. And introduced a very young Alan Armstrong as Keith, who was the mate of Jack's deceased brother Frank. The plot sticks sort of to the book, but does vary it from time to time. Now, in both the book and the film, Jack is working for East End gangsters Gerald and Sid Fletcher. And at the same time, Jack is having a clandestine affair with Gerald's mistress, Anna, played by Britt Ekland. He's planning to run away with her and start a new life and a new perfidious career in South Africa, working for a local gangster called Stein. However, he hears that his estranged brother has died in a drunk driving accident. Now, right from the start, Jack is alerted to the fact that this can't be right, because he knows his brother Frank never drank and always drove very carefully. When he sees Frank's car dragged out of the river and one of the riverside scrapyards, he realises that the car has undoubtedly been tampered with and that Frank's death was certainly no accident. So he comes north to begin to ask questions. On the train north, he sits next to a stranger, a man who has a particularly distinctive ring. There's no particular reason for this, but this individual will reappear significantly later in the film. He's not in the book. Now, Jack left Newcastle when he was a young man, when he was a young tearaway. He's never been back. It has nothing but bad memories. There's no nostalgia here. He's gone down to the bright lights of the West End gangsters, the Crays, and all of the other crime families, and made a great deal of money. He's utterly ruthless, totally savage, and doesn't have much in the way of redeeming features. One of the reasons why the character drew rather cautious critical acclaim, because it is essentially a dark film. This is British noir. Now, those of us who arrive in the 70s might remember the long bars, of course. Only one of which I think the Crown Posada now exists. But Ted Lewis tells us how Jack arrives in Newcastle as he gets a lift from a taxi driver. "How much is that?" I said. "5 bob," he said. "Here you are," I said. I gave him 7 and 6. "Thanks, mate," he said. "All the best." He made to take my bag towards the hotel. "That's all right," I said. "I can manage." He gave me the bag. I began to turn away. He said, "If you're off to be about during the next few days and you need out, driving anywhere like, give us a ring, right?" I turned to look at him. The blue of the neon and the dead yellow of his high street light made him look as though he needed an oxygen tent. There was an earnest, helpful look on his face. Rain looked like sweat on his forehead. I kept looking at him. The earnest, helpful look changed. "I told you," I said. "I can manage." He looked at the holdall, then at me, tracing back my words. He tried to frown, but a little bit of fear made him look more hurt than angry. "I was only being helpful," he said. I smiled at him. "Good night," I said, and turned away. I walked towards the door-marked saloon and opened it. I didn't hear him close his. Amateurs, I thought. Bloody stinking amateurs. I closed the door behind me. You had to give the landlord credit. He really tried to make it look the kind of place married couples in their 40s would like to come to for the last hour on a Saturday night. There was that heavy wallpaper in panels, the relief stuff that tried to look as though it was velvet. There was a photo mural of Capri. There were wall seats in leatherette that looked as though they'd been put in a couple of years ago. There was Formica and all the tabletops, and also on top of the bar. There was some plastic raw iron creating a pointless division. There was also a clean shirt on the landlord. Now, Jack, of course, has to attend the funeral. Before he goes to the funeral, he meets his teenage niece, Doreen. Now, there's a bit of a history with Doreen, or particularly with her mother, and it might well be the case that Doreen is actually Jack's daughter and not Frank's. But Jack's the black sheep of an otherwise grey family, and Frank never let him have anything to do with Doreen, whom he suspects is indeed Jack's daughter. Jack also meets Margaret, who is Frank's girlfriend, or sort of girlfriend. He's not too sure about Margaret either. And obviously, it's very awkward between him and his niece, because he doesn't know what to say to her. And the funeral, which is only attended by Keith as well as an additional mourner, is a pretty grim affair. We left the church and got into the car again. Doreen and I got into the back, and the vicar got in next to the driver. We drove along back streets. At one point, an old josser on a bike just as old gave us right away at a junction and slowly and gravely raised his hat. After a bit, the vicar leant his arm on the back of his seat and, looking round him, said, "You'll see some changes in the town since you've been away, Mr. Carter." "A few," I said. "Yes," he said, "things are changing, but not quickly enough to my mind. One day, though, all this will be gone, and then, thank heaven, people will have somewhere decent to live and bring up their children, somewhere they'll want to go home to instead of the street." I said, always assuming that what they replace it with will be better. "Oh," he said, "oh, but it must be. It's bound to be." "Is it?" I said. I looked at him. He had sandy hair and glasses and a yellow face. It was impossible to tell how old he was. We rolled down the hill to the cemetery. The day was bright and windy, and low, grey, fluffy clouds raced across the thin sun. After the funeral, Jack goes looking for Albert, Albert was one of his own contacts, who he knows hangs out at the racecourse. Albert sees him at the racecourse and does a runner. But Jack, at the races, also sees another old acquaintance, Eric. Now, Eric, of course, is a gangster. Eric is wearing his grey chauffeur suit and dark sunglasses, played by Ian Hendry. Jack and Eric have a tense exchange. Jack senses that Eric knows something about his brother's death. When they part, Jack follows him in his car, and Eric drives out to the country estate of Mr. Kinnear. Now, Mr. Kinnear, played by John Osborne, is the local Mr. Big, a serious gangster, who Jack suspects has links with the Fletchers in London. He's not wrong. Jack gate crashes one of Kinnear's poker parties, where he attempts to get some information out of Kinnear, but Kinnear is sly and subtle and tells him nothing. He also meets one whom he assumes to be Kinnear's girlfriend or one of his string of mistresses, Glenda, who's very glamorous but also completely drunk. As he's leaving, Eric sidles up to Jack and warns him not to get between the Kinnears and the Fletchers, and that he's getting into rather hot water. Jack returns to his lodgings, where a bunch of heavies try to persuade him by forcible means to return to London. He decides not to. He gets the better of the heavies and captures the middleman who's been sent to take the message. He terrifies him, watched by a horrified Keith, into giving him a name, and that name is Cliff Brumby. Now, here there are echoes of Stafford and Vaglio, because Brumby owns slot machines and amusement arcades, big business in the 60s. He's a wealthy and successful man, exists kind of on the margins of the dark side. Jack drives out to Brumby's house, where his teenage daughter's having a riotous party. He accosts Brumby, but it turns out, quite obviously, Brumby has no idea who he is, has no idea what he's about, and Jack realises he's obviously been set up. So he decides then to question Margaret. Margaret, so what was going on between you and Frank?
He was alright with me.
Alright, but just another bloke, really.
Nicer than most.
Yeah, but still just another bloke.
Yeah.
Nicer than most, though.
I can't help the way I am.
So, how often did you see him?
Once a week.
It's pretty regular.
Well, he was gentlemanly. I like that.
So once a week you like a gentleman?
Why all the needle?
Because, Margaret, I know you're lying. What was going on? What was actually going on with Frank?
He wanted me to leave Dave, and he wanted me to marry him. He said he'd kill himself. I was frightened what you might do.
You're a lying cow, Margaret. Look, Frank wasn't like that. I'm the villain in the family, remember? So I want to know who killed him.
I don't know nothing.
At this point, Jack has company again. The Fletchers, alarmed at what Jack might uncover, have sent two of his associates, Con McCarthy and Peter the Dutchman, played by George Sewell and Tony Beckley, to drag Jack back by force. He gets the better of them and eludes them. But at this point, they've been tailing Margaret and they catch up with Jack. However, Glenda roars in a white sports car and spirits Jack off to a meeting in the iconic Get Carter car park, unfortunately no longer with us, where again he meets Brumby. Now, Brumby is a bit more forthcoming this time. He's planning a restaurant, because there was actually a restaurant in the car park when it existed. And the fact is the Get Carter car park meant it had several stages of execution when it was due for demolition. Brumby tells Jack that Kinnear is trying to take over his business, trying to muscle in, and that he believes Kinnear was responsible for the death of Frank. He offers Jack £5,000, a lot of money in those days, to kill Kinnear. And Jack, at that point, refuses. Jack goes back with Glenda. He goes back to her flat, a luxury apartment flat, provided, presumably, either by Brumby or Kinnear, or jointly funded by both. They have sex. When Glenda goes in the bath, however, she leaves running what turns out to be a pornographic film. Jack watches the film, more out of idleness than anything else, but then he becomes riveted and horrified. For his niece, possibly daughter, Doreen, is in the film, where she's forced to have sex with Albert. Glenda and Margaret are both also in the film. Jack goes through to Glenda. I should give you an Oscar.
You've seen the film then?
Who was the young girl then?
I don't know.
Did Albert pull her?
I don't know.
Nah, not Albert's style. How about Eric? Did Eric pull her?
How should I know?
You're a lying cow! Glenda, you know exactly what was going on. What was her name? Do you know what her name was?
I think the girl's name was Doreen.
That's right. That's right, Glenda. Doreen. Doreen Carter. That's my name. Jack then forces Glenda's head down into the bath, almost drowning her, to extract the information that he requires. And what he finds out is that indeed Caine was behind the film and Eric was the fixer. He was the man who pulled Doreen and recruited both Glenda and Margaret, who were regulars in Caine's sex films. Jack decides to confront Brumby, and he locks Glenda in the boot of her car and roars off back to the car park. Now, in the car park, he accuses Brumby of being behind the film. Brumby denies it. He, of course, blames Caine. But he admits that it was he, Brumby, who showed Jack's brother Frank the film, hoping that Frank would inform the police and that they would then take action against Caine, even though he has many of the police on his payroll. The problem was, Eric and his heavies got to Frank before he could speak to the police, and it was Eric and Caine's men who arranged Frank's death. Now, in the movie, at this point, Jack beats up Cliff and throws him off the top of the iconic car park. Actually, in the book, that doesn't happen. In the book, Brumby gets away because he still thinks that Jack is going to kill Caine on his behalf. Look, Cliff, I said, stop wasting your money on insurance. I don't want you. I've told you. Just a deal as before. Brumby breathed in and took out the 2 bundles of very new notes and put them on the table. I didn't touch them. Brumby looked at me. And the rest, I said. Brumby carried on looking at me, but his expression didn't change. Eventually, he slid his hand into the briefcase and laid 2 more bundles of the same size on the table. I smiled at him. Never sell yourself short, Cliff, I said. After all, it's your life. You've only got the one. Gradually, he relaxed and let himself give some sort of a smile. So, he said, where's Caine's place? Near Sowerby. He's got an estate. It's off the Doncaster Road. I know, you go through Malton. When will you do it? Tonight? Maybe? Caine's got a party on. A weekend do. Supposed to look like a house party, except it's not. Glenda's going. A few foreign clients, a few interesting diversions laid on. Down in the basement, like. He's got it all kitted out down there. I can imagine. Perhaps that's where Glenda is now, he said, looking at me. Perhaps. He looked away. Well, he said, we may as well have a drink on it. May as well. Brumby poured the scotch. We drank. To Caine, I said. Brumby poured some more. What will you do, he said. Let me know. Maybe. It depends. On what? Things. We drank again. Brumby poured himself another, very large. Not for me, I said. I stood up, and Brumby finished his drink and stood up too. Anyway, he said, I suppose you'll know soon enough. Suppose you will. He kicked the briefcase shut and picked it up. I picked up the money and shoved it in my pockets. Brumby shrugged his overcoat close around him and walked into the hall. The projector was still going full belt. Better shut it off, I said. Brumby was standing by the open door. I joined him, and we went out into the grey day. Brumby closed the door behind us. There was no one else about. We walked towards the lift. The misty rain was dense enough to practically obscure the neighbouring blocks. Only dull light spreading soft at the edges were evidence of the other flats. As we walked along the balcony, Brumby was talking to me about how glad he was everything had finally worked out all right. How he'd been a bit worried about telling me what he knew, etc., etc. The cold air and the warm scotch had made him a bit lightheaded. He was like a man talking to himself. We stopped outside the lift. I pressed the button. Somewhere down below, the door slid to. Now, at this point in the book, Jack is planning to kill Brumby, but Brumby manages to, in fact, make good his escape. Jack is now finding himself once again pursued by the two heavies, who've been joined by Eric. Clear evidence that the Fletchers and the Caine are in cahoots. Worst of all, Eric has found out about Carter's relationship with Anna, Gerald Fletcher's girlfriend. They'll deal with her in London. He knows he can now never go back. So he has £5,000 money from Brumby. He just now has to finish off the business being Caine. The heavies and Eric pursue Jack onto the Tyne ferry, where there is a shootout on board the boat. In the course of the gunfight, Jack kills Peter the Dutchman, who's a rather unpleasant, sadistic character, but the other two, Con and Eric, escape. As they escape, they back their Land Rover up against the white TR6, I think it is, which has Glenda in the boot. They don't know she's in the boot, not that they would care, and they push the car into the river. "Your motor!" says Con, and off they go. Of course, Jack probably hasn't seen the last of them. He just now has to pull all the ends together, the loose ends together, join them up, and deal with Caine. Now then, Jack has to settle his account with Caine before he disappears to South Africa, and he thinks he'll take Doreen with him and actually adopt her effectively as his daughter. So he telephones Caine. Caine is in the middle of this riotous party and offers to give him back the film, the pornographic film, which of course would be enough to land Caine in jail, if he'll sacrifice Eric. So it's a trade, the film for Eric. Caine has no hesitation in sacrificing his subordinate and agrees he will send Eric to a specified location, as it happens, firstly Dunstan Staithes and then Blythe Beach, where the coal grabs were still working in 1970. But both parties have an insurance. In fact, Jack actually posts the film to the Vice Squad in London, knowing they're not corrupt, at least not as corrupt as the Northern Police are in relation to Caine, and that this could bring him and the Fletchers tumbling down. Caine too has an insurance. He telephones a hitman to deal with Jack after he has dealt with Eric, to tie up all the loose ends. Now, we've seen this assassin before. He's the man that Jack sits next to on the train during that wonderful opening title sequence with a thumping score by Roy Budd. Jack has a surprise, however, for Caine. He kidnaps Margaret at knife point and takes her to Caine's estate, where there's parties in full swing. And then he kills her. So here they are at Caine's estate. And I'm afraid it's goodbye, Margaret. Ugh. He leaves the body there to be found as further incriminating evidence on Caine. Now, Eric, he meets on the beach. And in the film, he beats Eric to death with a shotgun. And then as he's about to throw the incriminating shotgun away into the sea, the marksman shoots Jack clean between the eyes. And that's the end of the film. It's not the end of the book, though. In the book, the book has a very different ending, and one which actually leaves scope for Jack possibly, just possibly, to survive, as indeed he appears in 2 sequels. Eric stops crawling. His head jerks about from side to side, trying to see where my voice is coming from. "Over here," I say. "I'm up here, Eric." This time he freezes. When he finally managed to move again, his head swivels slowly round till he's looking at me. The movement is like that of a lizard on a warm rock. "Get up," I say. He gets up. He doesn't take his eyes off my face. "Down," I say. He doesn't move. I show him Con's shooter. I said down. He walks to the edge of the kiln and slithers down into its eroded, overgrown side. Lean against the kiln with your back to me. He stretches his arms out and does as he's told. There's nothing else he can do. I climb down from the kiln and stand and look at Eric for a minute or two. Then I ease myself up to the edge of the vat next to the shotgun and the bottle. "Turn round," I say. He turns round. I look into his face and smile. "You look as though you could use a drink," I say. He sways slightly and tries to straighten up again, but he can't quite make the true vertical again. "So why don't you join me? After all, you're a drinking mate of my brother, weren't you?" A skin of geese flies over from the river. "Come here," I say. He seems to have difficulty in putting one foot in front of the other. When he finally gets to me, I pick up the bottle. "Let's have this one with Frank," I say. He doesn't move. "Take it," I say. Somehow, he managed to stretch out an arm and take the bottle. I look into his eyes until he forces himself to lift the bottle to his mouth. He tips the bottle and opens his mouth, but because he's trying not to swallow, the whiskey runs out the sides of his mouth and down his neck and chin. "Swallow it, Eric," I say. "Every drop, just like it was with Frank." He puts the bottle to his mouth again and takes a sip, and then another. And the third time I put my hand to the base of the bottle and hold it, tilted, so he's either got to drink or choke. This is where I'm very, very wrong. I have one hand on the bottle, and my other hand is gripping the inside edge of the vat to stop me falling forward as I tilt the bottle. I am wide open. The movement is very slight. I'm concentrating on his face, and it isn't until I hear the thin click that those things have I know what's happening. For a split second there is unbelievable coolness. The bottle smatters on the edge of the vat. Then the heat comes and pain climbs inside me. As the blade leaves me, I fall sideways along the edge of the vat. Eric lunges for the shotgun, but as I roll over, I catch the stock with my foot, and the gun slides off the rim and clatters down inside the vat. I continue rolling, and for a moment, I'm staring up into the sky and it is red. Then I fall. I land on my back, my torso on a pile of bricks, my legs in a few inches of water. Eric then decides to finish Jack off, not with a knife, which would be smart, but by using the shotgun, Jack's own shotgun. As he levels and takes aim and tries to pull the trigger, the old gun, which hasn't been fired for years, misfires and bursts, killing Eric, leaving Jack badly injured, lying in several inches of water in the old vat. And that's where the book actually ends. That's where we leave Jack. Doesn't look too good for him, but he's not dead. And it certainly works out that Lewis decides to resurrect Jack for 2 more sequels. Ted Lewis himself died at the very early age of 42 in 1982 from alcohol-related illness. When the film was first released in 1971, it met with mixed critical acclaim and mixed success at the box office. But in the intervening half-century, it has become iconic, one of the defining motion pictures to be filmed on Tyneside, and still holds that high status even today. And of course now, as we read the book, as we tour the few sites that are left from the film, we're keeping that memory alive. Get Carter Heritage.
Good evening and welcome to Heritage Hour. It's been a few weeks since we did a live Q&A, and we hope you've been enjoying the sunny evenings. We're back just in time for a damp evening, just right for staying in. And for the Q&A, you can type any questions or comments that you have for John into the comments box below the live stream. We hope you've enjoyed John's talk this evening, and it's a great pleasure to welcome John this evening to answer any questions you might have about Get Carter, the book or the film. John is a military historian with expertise across many periods of history. Good evening, John.
Oh, excuse me. Good evening. Good evening.
Sorry, I got you there. Okay, so I'm just remembering back to watching the film and kind of seeing the sort of the car park as this modern in contrast with a lot of the other architecture and the environment, the physical environment that you'd see in the film. And the car park was this, this huge new modern monolith, this bright future. I'm wondering, obviously, Jack, you mentioned Jack talking about the is what's coming next going to be any better, and he's quite skeptical. What can you tell us more about how people viewed buildings like that at the time?
The car park, this famous car park, which is really made famous by Get Carter, I think it actually had 3 stages of execution when it was due for demolition, purely on the basis that it was associated so obviously with the film. Now, in the 1960s, when I was a boy, the car park represented a phase of, I think, what is now called brutalist architecture, which was quite popular at the time, but people had mixed reviews. And of course, Newcastle in the 60s, and this perhaps was something else which influenced Hodges with the film, was going through something of an architectural revolution. Thomas Daniel Smith, T. Dan Smith, a highly controversial figure in his day, and indeed now, to some he's an icon, to others he's just a villain. He had a vision for Newcastle Tyneside as the new Brasilia. He wanted to build an exciting modern city, do away with a whole load of slum buildings, but also do away with a lot of period architecture and rebuild in this brash, brutalist style of the 1960s. It wasn't entirely popular at the time. And there were a lot of questions about corruption involved in the construction processes. A lot of the materials that we used were shoddy and substandard. And Smith himself became enmeshed in a whole rather insalubrious wrangle over corruption and cronyism, words we hear a lot today, and of course eventually went to prison. And there has been a lot of controversy over his legacy ever since. Those who think he was a great hero, those who think he was just a rather inept villain. So that's all part of, in a way, part of this Get Carter story. It's not in the book, it's not in the film,
Right.
but for all of us here, it is part of the background.
Great. No, that's really interesting. I don't know that much about T. Dan Smith, so it is quite interesting to kind of remember that context. And obviously, like you say, it's not in the book, but it's very much there in the film. So let's have a look and see if we've got any comments or questions through. We've got a few people who've said they're watching. Anybody got any more questions about John's talk? Any of the locations, any memories other people have would be very welcome. In the meantime, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the sort of organised crime which Tyneside was reputed for in the 1970s. You mentioned the slot machine kings, wasn't it? Was that a money laundering scheme, or what was going on?
Well, the one-armed bandit, who picked up a slot machine, came into fashion in the 1960s. And in London, there were these notorious crime families, the Crates, of course, being perhaps the most notorious, the Richardsons. And at one time, it was perceived that Newcastle was an area of opportunity for organised crime. And it is said that the Crates actually came up here to try and effectively take over, but they were met by, should we say, representatives of the local interest at the station, and told that the best thing to do is get back on the train and go back to London. Now, it takes a very brave man to stand up to Ronnie and Reg, but they did go back. Meantime, there was this slot machine boom on Tyneside. Every pub, every club, and the working men's clubs were booming, had slot machines, and the amount of money coming through the machines was enormous. But of course, it wasn't traceable, certainly it wasn't taxable. So two men, Dennis Stafford and Vincent Lavaglio, ran this, a bit like Cliff Brumbies. There was a real life Cliff Brumbies. They ran this slot machine empire. One of their associates, a man called Angus Sibbett, was found shot to death in the back of his Jaguar motor car in 1967. There was a sensational trial which sort of lifted the lid off this seamy Newcastle underworld. And both Stafford and Lavaglio went to prison for his murder, though they always denied any involvement and continue to deny it to this day. And that sensational trial, coupled with the stories of corruption and double dealings in city centres and all this business of T. Dan Smith and contractors, and Coulson, the architect, of course, was involved. And so it created this kind of slightly sensationalist, almost underworld aspect of Newcastle, which a lot of people found quite exciting. And of course, Get Carter fits perfectly into that.
Yes, I guess that's what you've called it, Tyneside noir.
Yes, Tyneside noir. Yes, exactly. Yes, yeah. Even though Ted Lewis gets the credit for creating the British noir crime generation, and of course he wasn't a Tyneside man. Nonetheless, we seem to have borrowed some of that credit, should we say.
Right, okay. And you did talk about the idea that Jack could send the film off to the Vice Squad in London rather than entrusting it to the local police force.
Yes, in the book, it's quite obvious, or it is certainly implied, that Caine has corrupted a number of police officers in Newcastle Constabulary, and that therefore he has protection from prosecution in relation to all the various illegal activities he carries on. Much of it centres on pornography, illegal gambling, pornography, of course, were both banned at law at that time. Jack therefore posts the film to the Vice Squad in London because they're not really part of Caine's ring. And they're also looking for ways to bring down the Fletchers. So Jack thinks he might have dealt a mortal blow to both his former employers, now his enemies, and of course his local enemy, Caine.
Right. Okay. So we've got some nice comments here. We've got Bob Dixon watching and Lee Cook. Lee Cook says decent story and great film.
Yeah.
And then we've got Bob Dixon says the six-fingered man in the Newcastle Long Bar. Can John say anything about this?
No, a lot really. It was something. Can I say, when I went to the cinema, I never even noticed that the guy in the bar had six fingers. It became a sort of cause celebre afterwards, because the film has these two instances which don't appear to fit, but add a certain mystery. That's one of them, the six-fingered man in the pub. The other one is the fact that as Jack comes up on the train, he's sitting in the carriage with the guy who will be his assassin. You know that because you recognise the signet ring that this guy's wearing. So it slips in these kind of coincidental elements which don't necessarily appear to be part of the story, and yet add to a kind of a build-up of mystery. I don't actually know much about the six-fingered man, other than the fact he had six fingers.
But I guess it just adds to the kind of the feeling of Tyneside noir, doesn't it? You've got
absolutely,
kind of interesting characters, sort of, that you can imagine there's a bit of a backstory going on there.
Colourful characters.
What? Sorry, what did you say?
Colourful characters, to say the least. Yes.
Yes. So Bob also says that he met Vince Lander in Athens when on the run, using an assumed name. So that's an interesting experience. And
I met him as well, actually, years later, when his name was Lander, not Lavaglia. I thought he was a thoroughly nice chap, I have to say. Yeah, very well presented, very polite. Obviously, I had nothing to do with him or his slot machines.
And we have a message from Lee Cook saying the long bar in the film was exactly where exactly was that in today's layout?
It was the bar on Neville Street, which was opposite the Central Station. I don't even know if it's a bar anymore, but it was, and it wasn't. I think it wasn't really a long bar in the traditional sense. The long bars were down near the quayside. As far as I'm aware, and haven't been thrown out of anywhere interesting in Newcastle recently, I think the Crown Posada is the last of the long bars. It certainly was.
Right. Okay, and we've got another message from Lee Cook saying Dennis's daughter Paula was my babysitter in Lowfell. So it's quite nice to have these little local connections going on here.
Yeah,
this is really good.
Yeah, that's what really gives it resonance. Yes.
Liz says, interesting presentation, thank you. I recently rewatched the film with a friend who was visiting the area, but had never seen the film. Thanks for explaining the plot. I might read the book now. And it's true, it is pretty hard to follow what's going on all of the time. There's, it isn't straightforward.
Yes. No, it does. I think Hodges' intent to make you think about the plot. And even though the book does differ in some respects, it's probably good to read the book before you watch the film. It'll help explain some of the apparent anomalies.
Right. Okay. I think that's a great idea then. So read the book first, and then
the book is superb.
Yeah, it makes a little bit more sense. I do remember getting a little bit lost watching it as well. You're not on your own.
It's quite complex. It is quite elliptical and quite complex.
Okay, and Liz also asks, can you say more about the author Ted Lewis? I've just Googled that there are other related books.
Yes, Lewis was born in Manchester in 1940, moved as a boy, or his family moved to Humberside, where he was taught at, I think it was art school, by a man called Henry Treece. Now, Henry Treece was one of my boyhood heroes. He was a hugely successful author in the 50s and 60s of young people's books, children's stuff, a bit like Rosemary Sutcliffe, historical adventures. He wrote 30 or 40 of them, quite a lot. And Lewis always said that he had been influential in forming his idea of becoming a writer. Lewis then went to London, where he worked in advertising and was quite successful at it. I think he published his first book in 1965, and Jack's Return Home, as it was called, was published in 1970. In all, he wrote 9 novels. The last one was GBH, which I think was published in 1980, a couple of years before he died. He had a lifelong problem with alcohol abuse, and that was eventually, it was alcohol-related illness that killed him at a tragically early age. Otherwise, he could have gone on, presumably, to produce more novels. I personally find, and I think I've read all of them, the content is quite variable. I think some of them, like Get Carter, GBH, and Billy Rags, are brilliant, absolutely era-defining in terms of crime writing. The others I think are not necessarily quite as good. And the Jack Carter prequels read a bit like prequels, but still entertaining. So, and Lewis has become, since his death, been recognised as, it's quite good for a writer to die young. I think it helps to get recognised as the father, if you like, of this genre of British noir. And thanks to the film, Newcastle, Tyneside has become associated with that style as well. And Get Carter is the defining element in it. So Lewis was a brilliant writer, I think. Certainly he's good, he's a brilliant writer. But clearly his life was marred by alcohol-related illness. And yet he never had any association with Tyneside. As far as I'm aware, I don't know if he ever came to Tyneside, certainly. And it was not his idea originally that Carter would be set in Tyneside, though I think he approved of the location when the crew chose it. But so, yeah, a brilliant talent, and not with us for anywhere near long enough.
Thank you. And we've got a couple more comments we've got Lee. I love the scenes in St Cuthbert's village as I delivered papers there as a boy. And then we've got Bob saying, I was standing on the corner of Argyle Street in Hebburn when Michael Caine came out of the bookies. I just think it's great that this, you know, has really triggered some nice memories and some, you know, and particularly rooted in place as well, you know, in locations. Absolutely. It's really good.
Unfortunately, I was doing A-levels at the time. Otherwise, I had the chance as a very youthful extra to be one of the, obviously want somebody who was dissipated and a bit decadent, one of the guests at Kinnear's garden party. I couldn't do it because I was doing A-levels, but a few of the guys I knew were actually appeared as extras in the film as well. So that always piqued my interest.
Wow. Yeah, all those faces from a long time ago now.
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Okay, well, I imagine we'll get a few people coming into the library to see if we've got copies of books. I know we've definitely got a screenplay in Gateshead Archive, which I've had a little look through. But I think yes, we'll read the book first, and then we'll know what's going on.
That's my advice. Yeah.
Right. Well, if there's any more comments just now, then I'll say thank you very much, John. I've really enjoyed watching the video. It was a really nice bit of fun, and it's just so nice to be able to go out and about for you guys to go and do some filming, doing a little bit more in the way of actually enjoying ourselves.
Marvelous. Lovely. Thanks very much, Lucy.
Great. So just in the meantime, we've got next week, we've got a pre-recorded talk about the Shipley Art Gallery from Anthea Lang. And we do have a prize draw at the moment for anybody who's been watching or following Heritage Hour. The prize is a choice of one book from the Gateshead Archive shop, and to enter you need to complete a short survey to tell us a little bit about how you found Heritage Hour over the last year. It'd be really helpful for us to get some feedback. And I'll pop the link for the survey in the comments box. Thanks very much, everybody, for watching and all of your questions and comments. I've really enjoyed hearing your reminiscences about Michael Caine and other interesting people. And thanks so much, John, and we'll see you again soon.
Indeed. Bye for now.
Bye.